In the year 1911, a British colonial anthropologist sat in a government office in southeastern Nigeria, staring at a report he had just finished writing. The report described a tribe of millions of people who circumcised their sons on the 8th day after birth, who refused to eat pork or scavenger birds, who isolated women during menstruation in separate huts, who divided their society into clans claiming descent from a single ancient ancestor, and who called their supreme God by a name eerily close to the Hebrew word for the Almighty. The anthropologist knew exactly what he was looking at, and then, according to the documentary record, the file was quietly set aside. Because if this report were taken seriously, it would have shattered the entire justification for the British Empire's presence in Africa. It would have meant that the so-called primitive natives of the Niger Delta were not primitive at all. It would have meant they were carrying, inside their villages, a legal and religious code older than the Roman Empire, older than Islam, older than Christianity itself. This is the story of the Igbo people of Nigeria and the centuries-old tradition that traces their origin back to one of the 12 tribes of ancient Israel. This is the story of Eri, the legendary ancestor of the Nri kingdom. And this is the story of how, again and again, the men who had the power to investigate this connection chose instead to look away. Let's set the stage properly, because this is not some fringe internet theory invented yesterday. We are talking about the Igbo, one of the largest ethnic groups in Africa, numbering somewhere between 30 and 40 million people today, concentrated in southeastern Nigeria in cities and regions like Enugu, Onitsha, Owerri, Aba, and Nsukka. For centuries, Igbo communities have maintained an oral tradition known among scholars as Igbo Hebraism, sometimes referred to by community members themselves as the B'nai Israel tradition, meaning children of Israel. According to this tradition, certain Igbo clans descend from a man named Eri, said to be the founder of the ancient Nri kingdom, and through Eri's lineage, a connection is traced back to Gad, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and the namesake of the Tribe of Gad in the biblical account of the Israelite Confederation. Now, I want to be very clear about something right at the start, because this matters for how we treat this story honestly. This is a tradition. It is a belief held and transmitted across generations within specific Igbo communities, documented by outside observers for well over 100 years. It is not something this video is going to declare as proven historical fact. But what makes this story extraordinary, what makes it worth 40 minutes of your time, is not just the oral tradition itself, it's what colonial-era observers wrote down when they encountered it, and what happened to those observations afterward. So here is the question we're going to spend the next half hour digging into. If a population of tens of millions of people in West Africa has, for centuries, independently practiced customs that mirror the legal code of ancient Israel, circumcision on the 8th day, dietary restrictions resembling kosher law, ritual purification practices, lunar calendars, Levirate-style marriage customs, and a name for God that linguists have noted bears resemblance to ancient Hebrew terminology, what does that tell us, and why, when British missionaries and colonial ethnographers documented these similarities in writing over 100 years ago, did those documents end up forgotten, reinterpreted, or buried in archives that almost nobody reads? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why some historians believe the Igbo story is one of the most under-discussed mysteries in the entire history of the African diaspora's connection to the ancient world. And I want to know what you think, too. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think a people can carry the memory of where they came from in their daily customs, even after thousands of years and an ocean of distance? Let's get into it. To understand why the Igbo Hebraic tradition is taken seriously by some scholars and dismissed by others, we first have to look at the customs themselves, because this is where the conversation always starts. The most frequently cited practice is circumcision, performed on the 8th day after a male child's birth. In the biblical text, the covenant of circumcision given to Abraham specifies the 8th day as the appointed time. Among many Igbo communities, this same 8-day timing has been documented as traditional practice for generations, predating sustained contact with European Christianity or Islam. Now, circumcision itself is practiced across many cultures worldwide for many different reasons, so on its own this wouldn't mean much. But it's the specificity of the 8th day timing, combined with everything else, that has drawn attention. Next, consider dietary law. Traditional Igbo dietary customs in many communities have historically excluded the consumption of pork and certain categories of animals considered unclean, alongside specific slaughtering practices intended to drain blood from meat before consumption. If that sounds familiar, it's because the biblical dietary code, outlined in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, contains remarkably similar restrictions: the prohibition on pork, the prohibition on animals that die of natural causes, and the requirement that blood be drained from meat before consumption. Anthropologists who documented Igbo village life in the early 20th century repeatedly noted these dietary parallels, sometimes describing them as curiously similar to what they called Mosaic law, a term referring to the legal code attributed to Moses in the Hebrew Bible. Then there's the practice of isolating women during menstruation, sometimes in a separate hut or designated space within the family compound, with the woman returning to normal household duties and activities after a period of days. This practice again mirrors the purification laws found in Leviticus chapter 15, which describe a woman as ritually impure during menstruation and prescribe a period of separation. Many cultures around the world have practiced menstrual seclusion in various forms, so on its own, this proves nothing. But when you start stacking these practices on top of each other, 8th day circumcision, kosher-style dietary law, menstrual seclusion, and we're just getting started, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. Marriage customs add another layer. In many traditional Igbo communities, there has historically been a strong preference for marriage within one's own kindred group or clan, alongside strict prohibitions against marriage to close relatives, a structure that some researchers have compared to the endogamous marriage patterns described among the ancient Israelite tribes, where marriage was often encouraged within one's tribe to preserve inheritance lines, as referenced in the Book of Numbers regarding the daughters of Zelophehad. Additionally, traditional Igbo funeral and mourning practices have included specific periods of ritual mourning, purification rites for those who came into contact with the deceased, and customs around burial that some early ethnographers compared to the purification laws in the Book of Numbers concerning contact with the dead. The lunar calendar is another major point of comparison. The traditional Igbo calendar, known as the Igbo calendar or Igbo Afor, is structured around a 4-day week, with these 4-day weeks grouped into larger cycles and traditionally tied to lunar observation for determining market days and agricultural cycles. The ancient Israelite calendar, described in the Hebrew Bible, was also a lunar calendar, with months beginning at the new moon and major festivals tied to specific lunar dates. Now, lunar calendars were extremely common across the ancient world. This isn't unique to Israel by any means, but it's another piece of the broader puzzle that observers have pointed to. Perhaps the most linguistically interesting comparison, and one that has generated real academic debate, involves the Igbo name for God. In Igbo cosmology, the supreme deity is referred to as Chukwu or Chineke, generally translated as the Great Spirit or Creator. Some linguists and researchers interested in Afro-Hebraic connections have pointed out phonetic similarities between certain Igbo religious terms and Hebrew terms for God, though it's important to state clearly that mainstream historical linguistics generally classifies Igbo as a Volta-Niger language within the Niger-Congo language family, entirely unrelated to Hebrew, which is a Semitic language. This is one of the most contested parts of the entire Igbo Hebraic tradition, and we're going to come back to it later in this video when we look at what modern linguistics actually says. But for now, just hold on to the fact that this comparison has been made by observers for well over a century, and it remains one of the most debated elements of the whole story. So we have a cluster of customs: circumcision timing, dietary law, ritual purification, marriage patterns, a lunar calendar, and a contested linguistic comparison, all of which echo, in some form, the legal and religious framework described in the Hebrew Bible. On their own, each of these could be explained as coincidence, or as the result of independent cultural development, or in some cases as influence from Islamic trading networks that also share some dietary and circumcision practices with Judaism. But the Igbo oral tradition doesn't just point to these customs as random parallels, it points to a specific ancestral lineage that is supposed to explain them. And that lineage runs through a figure named Eri. According to the oral traditions preserved by the Nri people, a subgroup within the larger Igbo ethnic family centered historically around the town of Nri in present-day Anambra State, their kingdom was founded by a sky being or divine ancestor named Eri, who is said to have descended to earth at a place called Aguleri sometime in the deep past. Traditional chronologies place the founding of the Nri kingdom somewhere in the range of the 9th or 10th century, though some oral accounts push the lineage back much further. The Nri kingdom that grew from this founding tradition became one of the most influential religious and political centers in pre-colonial Igbo society, with Nri priest kings, known as the Eze Nri, exercising spiritual authority, including the power to cleanse abominations, crown other rulers, and regulate ritual practice across a wide network of Igbo communities for centuries, a system that anthropologists have documented as functioning well into the 19th century before British colonial intervention disrupted it. Now, here's where the Tribe of Gad comes into the picture. Within certain strands of the Igbo Hebraic tradition, the lineage of Eri is connected back to Gad, the seventh son of Jacob, born to Jacob's concubine Zilpah according to the book of Genesis. The tribe of Gad in the biblical narrative was one of the tribes that received territory east of the Jordan River in the region of Gilead, known for skilled warriors. The Book of Chronicles describes Gadite fighting men in notably martial terms. Proponents of the Igbo-Gad connection point to the historical reputation of certain Igbo communities for military organization and warrior culture as a possible echo of this Gadite martial tradition, alongside the name Eri itself, which some researchers have noted bears resemblance to Heri or related Hebrew names found in some genealogical lists. I want to stress again, this is a traditional genealogical claim, transmitted orally and recorded by various researchers and community elders over past century or more. It is not something that can be verified the way you'd verify a birth certificate. But the persistence of this specific claim, not just we are like the Israelites in a general sense, but we descend specifically through Eri from the line of Gad, is part of what has made this tradition so durable and so interesting to researchers across generations. And here's where the story takes its sharpest turn, because this tradition did not stay hidden in Igbo villages, whispered only among elders. It was written down, it was documented in detail by British colonial officials and missionaries during the height of empire. And what happened to those documents afterward is where this story gets genuinely fascinating. The most significant figure here is George Thomas Basden, a British Anglican missionary who lived among the Igbo people for decades, beginning his work in Nigeria in the 1890s and continuing well into the 20th century. Basden became one of the foremost European authorities on Igbo culture and language of his era, eventually publishing two major ethnographic works, Among the Igbos of Nigeria, published in 1921, and a follow-up volume, Niger Igbos, published in 1938. Within these works, Basden documented in considerable detail the very customs we've just discussed, the circumcision practices, the dietary restrictions, the purification rites, the marriage customs. Basden was not a casual observer making a passing remark. He spent years living in Igbo communities, learning the language, and recording these practices with the meticulous attention typical of colonial-era ethnography, which, whatever its flaws and biases, often produced remarkably detailed first-hand records of customs that have since changed or disappeared. What's particularly striking is that Basden himself, along with other missionaries and colonial administrators of the era, repeatedly drew comparisons between Igbo customs and what they called Jewish or Hebraic practices. These comparisons appear throughout the ethnographic literature of the period, not as a central thesis that the writers were trying to prove, but almost as recurring asides, moments where the author seems to pause and say, in effect, "This is strange. This looks like something out of the Old Testament." The dietary laws, the purification rites, the calendar, these comparisons show up again and again in the margins of colonial reports and missionary journals from across the Niger Delta region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So why, if British observers were noting these similarities themselves, did this not become a major area of study? Why didn't this lead to expeditions, academic conferences, deep linguistic investigations into a possible ancient connection between West Africa and the Near East? This is where we have to talk about the intellectual climate of the colonial era and how it shaped and limited what questions were considered worth asking. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the height of what's now often called scientific racism in European academic and colonial circles, a framework of thought now thoroughly discredited that ranked human populations hierarchically and used pseudo-scientific reasoning to justify colonial domination. Within this framework, the prevailing assumption among many European observers was that sophisticated cultural practices, complex religious systems, or signs of advanced civilization observed among African populations needed to be explained as the result of outside influence brought in from elsewhere, usually from groups considered by colonial-era thinkers to be more advanced, such as populations from North Africa, the Middle East, or even, in some truly bizarre theories of the era, lost tribes of ancient Egyptians or Phoenicians. The idea that a West African population could have independently developed or independently preserved across millennia a legal and religious code matching that of ancient Israel on its own terms without some external civilizing explanation simply did not fit comfortably into the dominant intellectual paradigms of the colonial era. So when observers like Basden documented these Hebraic parallels, the most common interpretive moves were either to treat them as curious but ultimately superficial coincidences, or to speculate about contact with North African or Semitic traders and migrants at some unspecified point in the past. Explanations that, notably, still located the real origin of these customs outside of the Igbo people themselves, consistent with the colonial assumption that African societies were fundamentally recipients rather than originators of complex culture. There's also a more practical, administrative reason why this line of inquiry didn't go further. The British colonial administration in Nigeria operated under a policy framework often referred to as indirect rule, developed extensively under Frederick Lugard, who served as Governor General of Nigeria in the early 20th century. Indirect rule depended on categorizing and organizing native populations into administratively manageable units, often based on perceived tribal or ethnic hierarchies, and often privileging certain groups, particularly in northern Nigeria, as more suited to governance roles within the colonial system. A finding that the Igbo, who were often characterized in colonial administrative writing as fragmented, decentralized, and lacking the kind of centralized monarchy that the British found administratively convenient elsewhere in Nigeria, actually possessed an ancient and sophisticated religious legal heritage, connecting them to one of history's most storied ancient civilizations. This kind of finding simply didn't serve the administrative narrative the British were constructing. It's not that there was necessarily a single deliberate order issued to bury this evidence in some dramatic conspiratorial sense. It's that the entire intellectual and administrative apparatus of colonial Nigeria was structured in ways that made this kind of finding inconvenient, easy to set aside, and unlikely to be pursued further by the institutions that had the resources to investigate it properly. And so what happened is what so often happens with inconvenient observations buried within mountains of colonial-era documentation. It simply faded. The detailed ethnographic notes remained in print in works like Basden's books, sitting on library shelves in London and Lagos, available to anyone who wanted to read them, but never becoming the subject of the kind of sustained, well-funded academic investigation that, say, the search for Troy or the excavation of Egyptian tombs received during the same era. The Igbo Hebraic tradition continued to be discussed within Igbo communities themselves. It never disappeared from oral tradition, and it would occasionally surface in academic papers throughout the 20th century, written by a small number of researchers, both Nigerian and international, who found the parallels compelling enough to keep documenting. But it never received the kind of institutional attention that, let's be honest, a claimed ancient Near Eastern connection to a major world population anywhere else in the world almost certainly would have received. Now, let's bring this into the modern era, because this story doesn't end in 1938 with Basden's second book. In the decades since Nigerian independence in 1960, and especially since the late 20th and early 21st centuries, interest in the Igbo Hebraic tradition has experienced something of a revival, driven in large part by Igbo scholars, community organizations, and a growing number of Igbo Jewish or B'nai Israel communities who actively practice elements of Jewish religious life alongside or as an expression of this ancestral tradition. There are documented communities in Nigeria today, particularly in and around Abuja and parts of southeastern Nigeria, where individuals and groups identify with Jewish religious practice specifically because of this ancestral Hebraic tradition, maintaining synagogues, observing Sabbath, and in some cases seeking formal recognition from international Jewish religious bodies. On the academic side, the picture is more cautious and more contested. Modern historical linguistics, as we touched on earlier, classifies Igbo firmly within the Niger-Congo language family, specifically the Volta-Niger branch, with no established genetic relationship to Hebrew or other Semitic languages of the Afro-Asiatic family. This is a significant point that has to be stated honestly. The linguistic case for a direct ancient connection between Igbo and Hebrew in terms of the languages themselves being related is not supported by mainstream comparative linguistics. Researchers who study the Igbo Hebraic tradition today generally separate two different questions. The first question is whether the cultural and religious practices, the customs we discussed earlier, represent a genuinely ancient inheritance from some historical contact with Hebraic or Israelite adjacent populations at some point in the deep past, possibly through trans-Saharan trade networks, North African migration routes, or other ancient contact scenarios that are difficult to trace without more archaeological evidence. The second, separate question is whether the specific genealogical tradition, the Erie to Gad lineage, represents literal historical descent, or whether it represents what some researchers call a mytho-historical framework, a way that Igbo communities, like many communities around the world, have used a powerful and meaningful narrative, in this case, identification with the biblical Israelites, to explain and organize their own sense of identity, history, and moral order, regardless of whether a direct bloodline connection ever existed. Genetic studies of West African populations, including Igbo populations, have been conducted as part of broader research into African genetic diversity, and while these studies have revealed the immense genetic diversity and deep ancestral lineages present across West African populations, some of the oldest and most diverse human genetic lineages on Earth are found in Africa. No large-scale genetic study has produced a definitive finding of a specific, traceable ancient Near Eastern or Levantine genetic signature unique to Igbo populations, in the way that, for example, certain genetic markers have been studied in other populations with claimed ancient Israelite ancestry elsewhere in the world. This remains an area where, frankly, more dedicated research could be done, and where the current state of evidence simply doesn't allow for a definitive conclusion in either direction. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us in a genuinely interesting place, a place that's more honest and in some ways more compelling than a simple yes, it's true or no, it's a myth verdict would be. What we know for certain is this: the Igbo people of Nigeria, a population of tens of millions, have maintained for generations a rich and detailed set of customs, circumcision timing, dietary law, purification rites, marriage patterns, calendar systems that bear a striking resemblance to the legal framework described in the Hebrew Bible. We know that British colonial-era observers, including missionaries who spent decades living among the Igbo and learning their language, documented these similarities themselves in published works that remain available today. We know that the intellectual and administrative climate of British colonial Nigeria was not structured in a way that encouraged deep investigation into the implications of these similarities, whether through active suppression, institutional indifference, or simply the prevailing assumptions of the era about where advanced cultural practices could and couldn't originate. And we know that the Igbo people themselves never stopped telling this story about who they are and where they came from, through the line of Eri, through the Enri kingdom, and ultimately, in the tradition's own telling, back to the tribe of Gad. What does it mean if even a portion of this tradition reflects something real about ancient human migration and contact across Africa and the Near East? Connections that mainstream history, shaped for centuries by colonial frameworks, never fully explored. And what does it mean that a people numbering in the tens of millions have preserved this story, not in some forgotten manuscript, but in the living practices of daily life, passed down through countless generations, regardless of what the outside world chose to notice or ignore? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Does the persistence of a tradition like this across so many generations and against the backdrop of colonial indifference count as a form of historical evidence in its own right? Or does it remain, as some scholars argue, a powerful identity narrative that may or may not reflect literal ancient descent? There's no easy answer here, and honestly, I think that's exactly why this story deserves more attention than it's gotten.
Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this exploration into the Igbo Hebraic tradition as fascinating as I did, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the hidden and overlooked threads connecting Africa's history to the wider ancient world. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.